In this part, we will talk about graphs or charts or plots, which are generally the same. Graphs are mainly used in order to visually summarize the data so that we can get some insights that can help us take future decisions. Right now, later on in this series, we will talk in more depth about data visualization and how we can create the different plots depending on the data we have and depending on the aspect of data we want to focus on. So let's start with the first plot, which is box plots. Box plots are mainly used for depicting data through their quartiles, where we can get or glean a lot of information from box plots. So let's take an example here. With these data points here, this box plot were generated. Now let's dissect the plot into its main components. Here we have these lines, 1, 2, and 3. This line, or the left-hand side line, basically represents the first quartile or the 25th percentile. In this case, it's equal to 5. Right? The middle line here represents three things: the second quartile, the 50th percentile, and the median value. They are all the same. And in this case, it's equal to 9. The third line here, or the upper bound, represents the third quartile or the 75th percentile, which in this case is equal to 12. Now, on the right-hand side and left-hand side, we have two extra lines, and these lines are called the whiskers, because in some cases the box plot is called the box and whiskers plot. The whisker on the left-hand side basically represents the minimum value excluding the outliers, which is equal to 3 in this case. The upper whisker here represents the maximum value excluding the outliers, which in this case is equal to 13. Okay, now from the same plot, we can spot the outliers. So this here is an outlier, and this here is an outlier, which is 25 for the first one and 30 for the second one. Remember, we can spot outliers mathematically using the interquartile range by forming a lower boundary and an upper boundary. So apply that formula to the current plot and see if you were able to extract these outliers from the equation. Next, we have the bar chart. Bar chart is basically a plot that presents categorical data with rectangular bars, where the length of each bar represents the measurement corresponding to each category. Right, so here we have two variables, the car type and the average weight expressed in kilograms. Right, so here we have the different categories: sporty, small, compact, medium, large. And the right side we have the measurement of interest, in this case the average weight. So for sporty we have 2,813, for small we have 2,250, and so on. So here we move on to our bar chart. On the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we plot the type or the categories, like sporty, small, compact. On the y-axis or the vertical axis, we plot the measurement of interest, which is the average weight. Now the length depends on the average weight. The length of the bars depend on the average weight. So for sporty, the value is 2,813. For medium, the value is 3,305. And so on and so forth. So bar charts are most appropriate when we want to represent categorical data along with a certain measurement of interest. Next, line charts. Line charts are basically used to show information that changes over time. So the most important component of a line chart is the time element or the change over time element. So here we have a table of two variables, the day variable and the temperature reading corresponding to each day. So for Monday, the registered temperature reading was 20, for Tuesday is 21, and so on and so forth. Now in the chart, we move on and represent each temperature reading for each day as a simple point. After we are finished with plotting the points, we simply connect the points or the dots together to form our line chart in more terms. So from this simple line chart, we can see that there was a drastic increase in temperature from Tuesday to Thursday, passing by Wednesday, right? And then there was a relatively drastic decrease in temperature again from Thursday to Friday. Now, it can be simple to spot such a trend or a drastic change by simply looking at the data points here. But what if you had a table with, let's say, 2000 or 3000 temperature readings? Then simply looking at the data points won't be feasible or efficient. And now a line chart would be helpful for us to extract such an insight. Now, the pie chart is useful when we want a proportional representation of the data we have, right? So for example, here we have some crops or plants that were collected during a certain season, and we want to show how much each plant contributed to the whole yield in that season. So, for example, looking at all these observations, we can say that clover contributed to 30% of the yield. Corn contributed 17.5% of the yield. And the same measurement for the remaining crops. Now, we start creating this pie chart, right, by showing that the biggest sector or proportion of the pie were for clover, which was 30%. And the remaining ones are 17.5% each. Right, so the important thing or the important aspect of pie charts is the proportionality. All right. Next, we have scatter charts. Scatter charts or scatter plots simply graphs pairs of numerical data with one variable on each axis. Why? To look for a relationship between them. And we don't necessarily have to have only two variables like x, y. We can have x, y, and z, for example, where we can represent the data in 3 dimensions. Now, let's take a look at this example here. We have x and y with some readings or measurements. Now we start plotting our dots or points on this coordinate system. So for example, this dot here corresponds to the XY pair 5 and 22. What about this one here? As we can see from the tooltip, it corresponds to the XY pair of 7 and 40. Right? And the same thing for the remaining plots. Again, scatter plots are most useful when we want to study the relationship between certain variables. So here, let's take a look at some scatter plots and see or study the different aspects of these plots. When it comes to a relationship between two variables, we express the relationship in terms of 3 main aspects. The first one is linearity, which basically refers to whether the data pattern is linear, that is straight, or non-linear, or curved. When it's linear, then we want to focus on the slope aspect, right? Again, linearity first, linearity, then slope. The slope basically refers to the direction of change in the variable y when variable x gets bigger. Now, if the variable y gets bigger as x increases, then we get to say that the slope is positive. If variable y gets smaller as x increases, then we can say that the slope is negative. All right? And third aspect is the strength of the relationship. Strength. Basically, strength refers to the degree of scatter in the plot. So if the dots or scatters were widely spread, then we can say that the relationship between the variables is weak. Whereas if the dots were concentrated around a line or a curve of some type, then we can say that the relationship is strong. Now let's take a look at the different scatter plots here and see what we can read in terms of these aspects. So first, linearity. As we can see, the relationship here is clearly linear because we can draw a line where the data points concentrate around that line. Second, the slope is clearly positive, right? Because as x increases, y tend to increase as well. So for 4, we get this value, right? For points like 8, y tends to increase, and so on and so forth. The next plot here, sorry, before that, the strength of the relationship is clearly high. There's a strong relationship between the variables, right? Because they again tend to concentrate around a line. In the next plot, we can see that the relationship is also linear. However, the slope here is negative, meaning that as x increases, y tend to decrease. So if we take a point here, let's assume it's 4, we can say that y is about maybe 27. Take another point here, x is 10, but y is about 17. So as you can see, y tends to decrease as x increases. Now, what about the strength? Again, the strength of this relationship is high because the data points are not scattered, but they are however, they are concentrated around a line in this case. In the third scatter plot here, we can say that the relationship is not linear. However, there is still a relationship because the data points are concentrated around a shape of some kind or a curve of some type, right? In this case, it's a parabola. A parabola is simply an upward facing or downward facing U shape, right? And it's the shape of the quadratic equation, right? So there is a quadratic relationship between x and y in this case. What about the strength? Clearly, the data points tend to concentrate around the parabola curve. So there is a strong relationship between the variables. What about the last one? Here we can see that the points or the dots are all over the place. So there's clearly no relationship between x and y, right? There are many other types of relationships, right? Sometimes we have cubic relationships or higher order relationships, and I encourage you to explore those on your own. But the relationship that we will mostly see in the future is linear, which is of the form y is equal to mx plus b, where m is the slope value, right? And b is called the y-intercept. Now, we will talk about these components of the linear equation or the linear relationship in more depth in the future, but for now, just understand what the linear relationship is all about and how it looks like. All right?